It all started when I reviewed the first generation American Standard Washbreak urinal. This was basically my dive into reviewing traditional washdown urinals, and it really wasn't that good. While it wasn't all bad, some of the functionality problems were definitely noticeable, and the downsides of washdown urinals were definitely more prevalent on this urinal compared to previous urinals. A few days later, I reviewed the standard washer urinal, and the difference is honestly night and day. While yes, it was yet another washdown urinal, it was so much better. Not only was the design a lot more interesting and better, but the functionality and durability was definitely a lot better too. Keep in mind, I've only talked about a urinal from the 30s to 50s, and a urinal from the 60s to 70s. I haven't even delved into the current state of washdown urinals. Oh dear gosh! If there's one thing I love doing, I love riffing on modern washdown urinals. They are garbage. This honestly makes me question things more. How do we go from such iconic and classical urinals that actually held up fairly well, to useless garbage files that clog at the most minor inconvenience? Today we'll be taking a look at what I consider the rise and never-ending fall of washdown urinals. Now I'm mostly going to be referring to back outlet washdown urinals, not bottom outlet P-Trap urinals. Although in a future video I could definitely go over P-Trap washout urinals and how they're growing ever more irrelevant. But for today, we're going to be focusing on the rise and never-ending fall of traditional washdown urinals. How do we go from good and classical washdown urinals to the modern McDonald's shoebox dumpster fire quality of modern urinals? This is definitely going to be an interesting one. It is good to start with some inevitable downsides of most washdown urinals. This includes all. One is that these things are more capable of flooding. Considering that these things somewhat drain slower compared to other urinals, if there's too much water in the bowl and the design really isn't that good, these things are more capable of flooding. Another downside is that these things are more capable of buildup, especially if it has lower pressure and or is not very well taken care of. You are basically at higher risk of getting more mineral buildup. Let's first talk about the rise, which dates from the 1900s up until the 1950s or so. Towards the beginning of the early 1900s, washdown urinals weren't super common. Now there were a couple that existed, but eventually these urinals would start becoming more common sight. For example, I don't think a lot of people know that the washout wasn't even introduced until the 1930s. Yes, you heard me right, the 1930s. This was around the time that urinals were actually treated with love and care. A lot of passion went into these urinals. From their unique classical designs, up to their strong functionality and durability. This is a rise I don't think we'll ever see ever again. These urinals were actually good, and were designed with so much love and care. I dare you to compare a classical urinal from this timeline to a modern urinal. The differences don't even compare. They are so drastically different. And yes, while the designs got copied over and over, there are still some unique urinals out there that are different from others. This is a timeline I don't think we'll ever get back, and it's unfortunate to say. Now let's begin talking about the original fall, the 1960s. You heard that right, the 60s. This was a timeline where a lot of urinals started getting redesigned, or they introduced new urinals. For example, the original catalyst, the American Standard Washbreak urinal in 1962. And it never really got better, unfortunately. You had other introductions like the Crane Cromwell in 1965, and even some redesigns like the Ultra Correcto in 1964. Of course, I can name some other examples, but these are the few I like to point out for examples. Around the time of the introductions of new urinals, whether new or redesigned, the problems of washdown urinals became more prevalent. That doesn't mean that all of them were necessarily bad or anything, but the universal problems of washdown urinals were a lot more prevalent on these types of urinals. One of the most common trends I've noticed during this timeline was the introduction of toilet-like trapway openings on these washdown urinals. The Washbrook, the Correcto, the Cromwell, they all seem to have these toilet-like trapway openings. A big noticeable problem with this design choice is slower drainage. A lot of these trapway openings are very small, therefore it drains so much slower. Even if it didn't look like it, back in the day, a lot of these classical urinals with built-in strainers actually had decent water areas. Even if washdown urinals drain slower, they still drain relatively fast due to the larger water areas, which a lot of these newer 60s urinals were lacking, due to the smaller trapway openings reducing water flow. Unfortunately, the toilet-like trapway opening trend would be a much more common sight on most of these urinals. But not everyone went along with this trend. Kohler, for example, went with metal strainers on their Bardens, for better or for worse. The only company outside of Crane with their Crane Santa that went with traditional built-in strainers is the Briggs Lawton. And even that felt like it was just okay. I won't drown on the 80s for too long, considering that not much happened during this era. The only thing I would like to note is that the Washbrook and even the Bardeen somehow got even worse. That is basically it. The 1990s and 2000s era is what I like to consider the generification era, where every washdown urinal started becoming lifeless and unoriginal. Not to mention that this was also the movement that pushed for 1 gallon per flush for urinals. All urinals. So not only were they getting generified, they were also using less water too. Some companies worked around this, while other companies just stuck with their old designs and see how they stick. Most of the time though, they redesigned these urinals by the early 2000s or so. The generification didn't really start that fast though. It started kinda slow. Like for example in 1995, the American Standard Washbrook got thicker and had an extended lip. Later in 1998, they extended the lip of the Bardeen. But by the early 2000s or so, the generification became a lot more common. The 2000s is where a lot of urinals got generified, or they introduced more bland designs. By this timeline, a lot of urinals were knocking off the American Standard Washbrook urinal, or they were knocking off the Kohler Bardeen. Even if they weren't so top-notch, a lot of urinals got so bland around this time. Even the Briggs Lawton wasn't safe from getting generified. This was around the time where a lot of washdown urinals started becoming so plain and generic. And not to mention, worse. This was also the time period where a lot of problems started rising from washdown urinals. Constant flooding, constant clogging, and constantly getting out of order. Whether it was poor design choices or not, these problems were becoming a lot more apparent. And it never got any better. It just got worse. If you thought that the 1990s and 2000s was the bottom of the barrel for washdown urinals, let me introduce you guys to beyond the bottom of the barrel. The 2010s and the 2020s, or as I like to call it, the modern era. This era is an absolute disaster. Not only did it amplify many problems of the washdown urinal to an extreme degree, but it also showed some other problems. Like for example, the oversaturation of the washdown market. Holy crap! Sure, this era did reintroduce some small washdown urinals, which was kind of a thing of the past if you think about it, but it seems like every company every year introduced some brand new washdown urinal. There's so many! There's too many to choose from, and most of them are garbage. Not to mention that so many washdown urinals look so lifeless and unoriginal. Like most of these urinals are peak McDonald's shoebox designs. Lifeless, dull, minimalistic, and not to mention sometimes very unoriginal. Excluding the design factors being so bland and lifeless, a lot of these urinals started having so many problems too. Most of these modern urinals are terrible. For example, the modern Kohler Bardeen urinal has a very small water area. Same with the Kohler Dexter washdown urinal. The Zero Nano pipe looks not only stupid and hideous, but the water area is also pretty small too. And do I need to explain everything wrong with this crime against humanity? I shouldn't. Just look at it. But the biggest problem that most of these urinals have, outside of the fact that they suck, is the ridiculously small water area that they have. Like, I'm not even kidding. The water area of most of these urinals is literally a small circle. A ridiculously small circle. Meaning that they drain even slower than the urinals of the 1960s and 70s. Good job, guys. You really thought this one through. Unfortunately, the modern washdown urinal is a complete dumpster fire, and I don't see it getting any better. It's only going to get even worse. Not to mention that water reduction, and even enforcing washdown urinals through laws or regulations don't seem to help that fact either. Washdown urinals will probably never, ever recover. And that's what I consider the rise and never-ending fall of washdown urinals. What do you guys think about washdown urinals? Let me know down in the comments below.